Wanted to have her in to talk about her work because I think it's so important. Like we can talk about painting technique all day long, but I think it's so important to see how other artists are actually like applying technique in their work, how they kind of come up with ideas, their process, all of that is super essential. So, with all that said, I will turn it over to Eleanor to share about her work. So, thanks for being here, Eleanor.
Yeah, being there, I'm there virtually. I'm
Yeah.
physically sitting in a room in England, but I grew up in Point Loma. I didn't go to Point Loma Naz, but I love that campus. I love people that work there. So thanks for having me. I am going to share. I'm just going to walk you through what I'll be sharing with you. I am not currently in my studio. I'm currently at home because the internet in my studio loves to go in and out. So I recorded a short tour of my studio to share with you, and I'll do that first. And then I'll bring up a presentation, and we'll look through a bunch of work and talk about process and just talk a lot about painting. So without further ado, I'll share this video first. Recorded this yesterday. And can you see that, Kara? Everybody?
Yep.
Nodding heads. Okay.
Welcome to Lancaster, England. We're up on the northwest coast, right beneath the Lake District National Park. It's a typical kind of gray, rainy day, and my studio building entrance is right behind us. Just wanted to give you a quick peek at what the area looks like. Fall colors. This is Lancaster Castle right across the street, and we're in the historic core of the city. And all these buildings are from 1700s, 1800s, and the castle has at least one existing tower still from the 1300s, but it goes back to Roman times. So there's a lot of history here nearby, and I'll take you on inside. Okay, welcome to the inside of my studio. I have been in this space, I've been renting it now for about a month and a half, but 2 weeks out of that month and a half, I was on house quarantine with my flatmates, and yay, COVID. And we also moved from one house to another with them as they bought a house. So that was another week lost from studio time. So I've not been in here very long. And because I left most of my materials in the States, I've been receiving gifts, buying new things, and working pretty small at the moment. But let me just give you a quick spinning tour on my chair, and then I'll flip the camera around and show you in more detail kind of where I am. It's my work table. That's another painter's space. It's the other half of my space. There's another painter over here on this side, and let me flip the camera around and show you in more detail. So when you walk into my space, I've got this great thing. This space is kind of cut into two, and so I've been using it so far as one half being a reading, sketching, watercolor table with flat files for paper and materials, and then putting sketches. I'm currently doing a lot of watercolor sketches and pen sketches of paintings that I might want to make larger in oil. I am working on this one in oil already. Over here. So these are 5x7 on gesso board landscapes. I think my work is probably going to be focused on how different the landscape is here from the landscape, especially including the built landscape from San Diego. So for now, I'm just collecting images of those sorts of things. And then over here, I've got what I'll be using as my painting taboret. And you can see I brought very little with me from the States, some brushes and some paints. I brought my pochade box, and hopefully we'll get outside soon. Starting a painting on oil paper. The yellow is just tape, protecting, keeping it attached to the wall and protecting the edges for now. of a construction scene right across the street from my studio. Radiator, very important. Big window with the interior of the buildings that you saw from the outside, which is pretty inspiring for me to see. And then over here, I'm just doing some color studies of, this is actually a big painting on paper from San Diego that I chopped up and put in my suitcase. And I think the other half is on the back of this. Yeah, but I'm just doing some color studies of some new paints that I have, and this will be the working end of my studio. So that's what I'm working on now, just building up some new imagery and a new vernacular as I think about what my work is going to be looking like this year.
Okay, let me pull up a new screen. So that's my working space. And as I'm pulling this up, I'll just kind of chat. It is sparse at the moment because what I did in order to move here was to condense everything down to, in terms of studio stuff, to half a suitcase. And that was ridiculous and hard. But in the end, quite fruitful to kind of go through all my things. So what am I doing in the UK? Just a little bit of context, and then we'll dive into this. I have two main reasons for being here. Number one, my husband is European citizen, so we're here closer to his family now. And number two is twofold. I'm doing a full year of just working in the studio. I just finished my kind of side hustle, day job, administrative work last week, and left my remote job, and I'm spending the year making work. And then my husband is doing a master's program here. So as you've seen a little bit and just hearing me say painting a lot, I am primarily a painter. My work is very practice-based and centered very specifically on using the language of painting to analyze and respond to the shifting landscape around me. I'm largely inspired by what I can see in my visual atmosphere and the ways that we fit ourselves into our environment, sometimes forcibly by building on top of it and scraping it down. And I'm interested in just where we physically are in space and time, and the way that I source materials and generate ideas largely is just by looking and spending a lot of time watching light change and looking at the shapes around me, and refusing to, or trying to refuse to get sucked into the habitual, but instead choosing to look at things that I walk by maybe hundreds of times and question if I've actually seen them, or if maybe there's something new to be seen. So these are just views from my studio wall right before we moved. And you can see I tend to kind of build up a lot of detritus. And those, even though I'm going to now show you a bunch of slides of finished work, just know that as they were made, they had tons of things like this kind of built up around them on the walls. And Kara, I don't know if you like to just have people jump in with questions or if we wait till the end, but I'm comfortable either way.
Yeah, either one. I guess if you do have a question, is that okay if they just unmute and ask it?
Yeah, please.
Okay, then otherwise we'll do some questions at the end.
So I thought I'd start with a little bit of what I did in undergrad, and there's not much of interest from that time, but I was making a lot of kind of angsty self-portraiture work. These are two of them with images and patterns and colors from the way I grew up. And what kind of has stuck with me, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's little map references in the silhouette of a house and a little bit of a map over here. And those things were coming out of drawings that I had made as a kid, or kind of family photographs. And this is where I really locate my interest in architecture is that I grew up in a household that was renovating two Victorian homes. We were put to work as kids lovingly, but kind of painting columns and stripping wallpaper. And I drew this map. This is one page of a map that I drew, and I moved to the West Coast as an 11-year-old of kind of trying to remember where things were located in that house. And my brother and I were just always excited to be discovering nooks and crannies in those houses. And so I've chewed on those structures a lot. And when I came out from undergrad, found myself largely looking at shifting architectural spaces and how they fit in. These were both sketchbook pages from my time overseas. After undergrad, I moved to Madrid in Spain for 3 years. And I was reading a lot of work by the architect Louis Kahn, and he talks about how light and space, really simply, just how light and space dictate form and architectural shapes. And when I moved back to San Diego, I started just looking at buildings that were in flux and small events like demolitions, and recording them on site through sketches and drawings, and then paintings in my studio space, which at that point in time was just my living room, corner of my living room, and questioning, these things that seemingly are permanent, like a building, but that very quickly can be knocked down and reassembled into something new. And that work took me into my master's program, and I'm just going to kind of blaze through these. But I started to actively search through my neighborhood for sites that were undergoing change, that were going to be shifting from an empty lot into a new set of buildings, or a grove of trees that were being knocked down to make way for a parking structure. And as a painter, trying to figure out, okay, there's this language of construction fencing and machinery and hard hats and demolition netting that I need to learn how to interpret through color and brushwork and line. And that's what this work was all about. And I had lots of opportunity, luckily, to show the work and to be in conversation with folks in the area, this is all in San Diego, who worked in fields of urban development or city planning and demolition and architecture, and ask them what they thought of the work and what they thought of their own work, and just discovered that there's a beauty in fragmentation and seeing something half finished or half disappearing that can sometimes teach us more about the way that we're living than a fully finished building. This was a nice opportunity to show with an architect who makes sculptural forms. So those two standing structures are not mine. But looking at, this vast world that we occupy, and having to make a decision between, okay, can I record all of it? No, I can't. I can only record one thing, and I can only record it in one way. And so for me, that choice came down to drawing and painting and looking at single sites or single moments of change. And after kind of looking at those singular sites, I tried to take a step back to allow for some breathing room physically in the work by putting sections of space between them. In this case, these are on sheets of paper, but then also looking a little bit more at the physical landscape that structures are built on top of. And I will mention at this point, this painting here on paper stems from a small plein air study that I did on site, and all of my work stems from either being in a place physically and taking photographs, or doing sketches, or in some cases making a painting on site. But at this point in time, was really trying to think through ways of injecting some space into the paintings, because that's kind of how we see the world, through a car window, or we see a building as it's going up into stages. And I also think, especially as urban people, our cities are carved out by geometric parcels. And then also was thinking about the painting process, that the way that I work, at least, is not by conceiving this kind of finished painting before I'm even starting, but rather I discover a painting or a work as I go, and layering paint on top of paint, and trying to let parts show through. The process of editing just becomes kind of part of the conversation about construction and the way our landscapes have been developed. This is I'll show you an installation shot in someone's home here, but these are 3 standalone panels of a single site, of a big, I think 18-acre site of big demolition down in Mission Valley. And that was a site that I was given access to. And this all led me straight, this is all during my master's program, but led me straight into thinking about removal of the space itself out of the picture plane. So ultimately I just started cutting it out. But very much interested in this notion of fragmentation and the way the landscape gets chopped up. And this is my thesis exhibition. So the very tail end of my master's program in 2019, decided, after kind of thinking through all of these notions of zeroing in on one particular building as it's changing, pulling back out and looking at the landscape as it's changing, trying to cut it up into fragments in the way that we see the world, I distilled those ideas down into 4 separate pieces. There were a bunch of kind of sketchy works in here too. There's my grandfather. These works were, this one primarily is diving into notions of the landscape being bagged up and kind of tossed into trash bags and being stripped back and built on top of, and then eventually that built structure will of course decay and fall down into something else. This was one case study of a single family home that was carved into, or kind of sold as a development parcel for 40 different units. And just thinking about how buildings get built up and lived in, and then kind of padded up and destroyed, and at some point this will be demolished and turned into something new. This is of that big demolition site in Mission Valley, but watching it get built up on over time. I will mention my color palettes in most cases stem from something on the site. So this one, if you've spent much time in San Diego in the springtime, after it does rain, there's these purple lupine flowers that come up. And so they were coming up at the time I was making this painting. And so, and then the big building that's on the right corner of this painting when I was making it was also clad in bright purple plasterboard that was later covered up, but purple was the theme for this painting for those reasons. And that's pretty typical of the way I work. Just one color will get stuck in my head with each site, and that becomes the dominating color. And then I, like you all, have a liberal arts background that before painting, study a lot of drawing. And so drawing is kind of this backbone behind painting. And so I made this 30-foot long drawing collage, and it reads kind of as a linear narrative, but when you're standing in front of it, it's really hard to take it all in. But here's a few close-ups. Really roughly done with just paper cutout and a marker and charcoal drawing up the wall, but allowed myself to just really bring together a huge myriad of images that I had been looking at and thinking about for years, and just built them in the gallery, just put the paper up on the wall and built the whole thing in the gallery. And then got excited because I was allowed to reinterpret that drawing and cut it up into a smaller piece. This is about 25 feet long now. And it's got the dimensions on the wall because this is going to be installed at the San Diego airport sometime next year. They've got it rolled up in their storage right now, but the red pieces are painted paper that have been cut out and collaged on top of the big drawing. And the drawing itself is, I think, about 5 different pieces. And blaze through those. I'm happy to go back to any of them, but just wanted to talk a little bit about process and kind of how I work and where I collect imagery from. And so, like you all, I kind of live and breathe with one of these in my hands, and take 90% of my photographs with it, and try to do, I've started to be really intentional about how I organize them, because my photographs are often the things that I come back to as I reference things to build a new painting. And so I have a big foundation in just collecting imagery. And that first one is just a palm tree shadow, but I have a whole folder just for shape inspiration and things like that that are really specific to places. Like there are no palm trees where I am now. So there's lots of things that are really specific to San Diego, or really specific to a construction site or one area of architecture that become important to me to put into a painting, even if it's a really loose kind of abstract type painting. Second building block for me is a sketchbook practice. So I keep a pretty vibrant sketchbook practice, and they're really loose and they're really fast, but they're ways for me to reference things that you see in person that you really might miss in a photograph. And I do also, these are rough sketches, one in pen and one in oil paint, done on site of the same building for a painting later down the road. But drawing, I start almost every painting with a drawing on paper, just to think through the composition, how it's going to sit on the paper. Is it too straightforward? I don't know. Drawing, I think, is just a really good way to think through things that you can't just reason your way out of. And this is the plein air sketch. It's probably maybe 9 by 12 inches that I did for that larger work across 7 sheets of paper. And I'm a little, I wish I painted outdoors more. I'm going to work on it this year, but it's intimidating for me, only because people always come up to you. But I do like to paint from the primary source as much as I can. And The third is on-site visits. So this is really on the left, a really ghetto way of just kind of backlighting some grass that was growing up in an area along the river that I was visiting. And then I traced those, I printed that photograph, and then I traced the grass, and then I scanned it in, vectorized it, and made a screen print of it. And so these grasses were screen printed across a painting, just as again, as another way to think about bringing the site into the painting. And then the fourth thing that I do a lot is collaging, analog by hand with an X-Acto blade. Almost for every painting, I just print out a bunch of photographs that I've been looking at that are just, they're all pretty much from the same viewpoint. And collaging just gives me another way to look at them, to put shapes on top of them, to layer the photographs in a way that, kind of like with drawing, your hands know what they're doing in a way that I think the brain is not necessarily aware of. And so I make a lot of these and hold them up like this to see how big I want it to be in the painting. And in this case was probably moving it back and forth like a trombone slide to see, do I want it this big? Do I want it smaller? And then taking a photograph of that to remind myself later on. And then this is another photo collage that is the same building being built at 3 different stages of construction. So I visited it over time, and then took this photograph of myself holding a photo over 2 other ones. And then you can see that right there pinned up between 2 palm trees, just as a reference for when I start painting. And then this is how the painting process starts. So really loose for me, a lot of color, and painting things in on top of each other and negotiating what stays and what goes. And then I do sometimes scan those in and work with them really loosely in Procreate or Adobe Sketch to think through palettes, color palettes, and the line of things. And it's a really low risk way of just experimenting for me with color and shape before starting on the canvas itself. So that's a bit of process, and then I'll just show you a tiny bit of what I'm doing now, although there's not much yet. These are 2 photo collage and a little bit of painting collage that I made for the airport project, but then decided to use the drawing instead. I was going to blow these up and have them printed on vinyl, really large, kind of like mural scale, but I'm intrigued by the fact that I'm not a good photographer, and these are kind of like just stuck on with tape, and I'm going to be pursuing this kind of work for a little while I'm here in England, in Lancaster, in such a radically different landscape than the one that I'm used to, and comparing the 2. So this is a watercolor I did in San Diego. I'm also not a watercolorist, but it's what I've been doing mostly since I've been here. It's just, I've got a bunch of them with me. It's just making a bunch of watercolors of vegetables and buildings and lots of color studies and plants and more buildings, but just building up a bunch of these small studies to make myself aware of what is new for me, and different from what I know, and giving myself a lot of options in terms of the paintings that I'm going to make next. And this is my last slide. So I'm currently just slapping together photographs of, on the left, of San Diego landscape things that I was looking at and really intrigued by. In this case, kind of freeway side irrigation piping. And then on the right, the landscape that I've moved into, which is this kind of lush green, slate-filled gray sky space. And once I've got a bunch to chew on and chomp on in terms of watercolors and in terms of photo collages, then I'll start making some bigger paintings and see what they look like. But that's a bit about me and how I work and what I'm interested in and where I am now.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. That was so great to see so many different ways that you get material. And it's funny because, yeah, silent claps, we do after critique. We'll do that for you. We've done projects using a lot of the different methods that you covered, which is really exciting to hear like your actual experience with those. Like working from a photo collage is what we're doing now. We also did a painting from a site specific sketch, which you talked about. So that's really cool. I have like a bunch of questions, but I'll open it up to the class first. Do you guys have any questions you want to ask?
I do, but I don't know if I'm cutting anybody off. I can't tell.
Go for it.
Okay. I was wondering how you decide how free you want to be with the colors. Because my problem is I always like want to stick to the super realistic, and then I'm too scared to go bold with colors. But then if I go bold, I go way too far, and it just looks like a little kid's painting that doesn't know what color goes where. So I'm wondering how you find a balance between the two.
I wish I could tell you I had no moments where I felt like the little kid with too many crayons, but I think that's probably a great place to be. And I probably err on the side of letting myself go way to the extreme because you can always dial it back. Whereas it's harder to go forward if you've started with a bunch of washy white kind of neutrals. That will always kind of kill the relationship between, well, depending on what you're working on top of, but I try to preserve the bright surface as much as I can. And so I'll do a really thin wash on top. I'll see if I go back to any of these. So if you look in the left-hand corner of this big canvas, it looks like a light purple, but it's only because it's a really light wash on top of the white canvas. And that's one way that your question is not about preserving the background, but I try to preserve that as much as possible because it gives me a lot of leniency in terms of either going darker or kind of neutralizing that purple or just keeping it really intense. But you will develop a sense for as you paint more. I think you'll develop a sense for what can stay kind of closer to the natural color or the local color of your site, and then what maybe you want to call attention to something, and it would just be easier to just say, hey, here it is, it's neon pink, like pay attention to this thing over here. And yeah, I was definitely trained to try to paint things as close to their local color as possible, and that's really I think the best way to learn how to be as free with color as you can. You'll start to understand how you can play with color relationships and shadow and light, and letting some parts of your painting read with like the real rules of painting and composition, and then break a few rules on the side and let something be a totally different color. One one thing that I do a lot would be to make multiple copies of your painting in progress. So if you've got it like at this stage that I have this one here, take a photograph of it. And if you like to work digitally, just create like 5 different projects on whichever program you use, and just take a brush, a digital brush, or if you want to print out copies physically, and just paint on top of it with 5 different colors and see which one you respond to the most. That's one way that I work a lot to make color decisions. Yeah, I think it's just a balance. You play around a lot, and if you're scared of a color, just throw it on there and let it ride. And yeah.
Yeah, I think that's such a great question, Kaylee, and it's such a hard question, I think. But because color is so experiential, right? It's really about like testing things out and trying relationships. But I love, Eleanor, when you showed your example of just trying out different colors on Procreate or on your phone or whatever, where it's like lower risk. So you're not wasting all your paints or whatever. You're just able to like mess around with things. Yeah, that's so
Yeah.
great. I
Yeah.
love to see.
I think with this one, and then with anything that I've done, I mean, the digital realm is so lovely because you can just tap on an image and pull its color forward and say, oh,
Oh yeah.
like when I copy that color, it looks a lot more neutral than I thought it was going to. And so maybe I need to intensify it. And that's one way, but then also just mixing your own paints and trying to figure out, that's why I still do a lot of color studies, because paint doesn't always do what I think it's going to do. It will I'll come up with new color combinations all the time, and I typically only I think I only work with 8 or 9 colors normally, but I will still come up with unusual color combinations that I didn't know were possible, just manually mixing paint. So I think, yeah, definitely coming up with a hybrid practice that's low risk like this, that lets you just color swatch like you would in your bedroom. Like, do I want this color paint or this color paint, and what would that do to my surroundings and to the rest of the painting that I have? But then also occasionally just slap a color on your canvas and go home and come back the next day and see how you react. You know, get a good night's sleep, don't judge it immediately, come back a day later and see what your reaction is.
Yeah, that's such good advice. Other questions? Yeah, Laura.
So, my question is kind of like, how do you know when the piece is finished? Like, how do you feel like when it's finished completely? Because I notice how it's like overlapping, collagey, and I love that. But then how do you feel like it's done? Like, does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah, of course it makes sense. And I think I'm going back on my presentation to paintings where I've definitely gone past the point. This is probably a good one. So this painting actually started out as a triptych with 3 panels of paper that just wasn't doing it for me for some reason. And I just came in one day and flipped it over and cut a house out of it. And suddenly that felt right. And I think you will discover, again, the more that you paint, I've discovered that you have this intuition in you, and it lives in your gut somewhere, that is both trained because you're all taking classes on composition and line weight and value and rule of thirds and all of these different 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional notes on composition. You've got that training, but then you also have your intelligence, that in your visual intelligence, that just tells you, like, I'm following all those things that I've learned, but something still is missing and it's not quite communicating what I wanted. So like, where is the problem? And very often I've found that I've maybe painted over something or painted too much on top of something, and have to find a way to go backwards without having the beautiful like command Z, like I can't just go back. And so you'll have to edit it back a little bit. Um, and then there is also the notion that maybe I've not gone far enough, and so there's more to paint when you're not just painting to represent an object. And I think for me, it's definitely a combination of what we were just talking about, like taking a break, um, maybe working on something else, and distracting your brain with another project for a while until you feel like you haven't stared at it in a while and you can come back to it. Like when you're editing a research paper and you can't see it anymore and you're kind of cross-eyed and you really just really need to go like have a burrito or something. And you'll come back to it and you will have problem solved. I promise you. You will have thought about it even when you thought you weren't thinking about it. And suddenly you might say, oh, it's finished. It's doing what I needed it to do somehow. Or it's not finished and it's missing something. And I don't know what that is, but then you can hit your sketchbook, or you can take a picture of it and hit your digital sketchbook and just try out a bunch of options to see what it is you think that it needs next. And I do think that that probably really happens even when you're trying to be really representational and photorealistic, that there might still be some touch of something that's missing. And I was watching an interview with Peter Doig the other day. He's a British or a Scottish painter. And it was an exhibition he had in the National Gallery, and he was painting on one of his paintings even after they installed it. He just wasn't satisfied with the way that like a scuba mask was painted on some guy's face. And we all have that, especially the more that you get in tune with whatever your own style is or your way of working is, that even when like I've been loosening up a lot, my painting has gotten kind of messier. There's still things that you'll know in your gut are like it's working or it's not working. And yeah, building habits up around your studio practice will help you kind of navigate that. Is that?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I feel like listening to your gut is like something that we're not really taught to do in our everyday life, you know, like that's not something that's really celebrated in our society even. So I feel like it takes a lot of intentionality and focus and like training to like listen to your intuition. At least that's my experience. It's like such a muscle that you have to work.
Yeah. And I know that being a student, I mean, I just finished my master's last year. You are running a million miles an hour and doing like these impossible tasks in multiple disciplines. And I'll tell you something I was told when I was in my undergrad that I hated, and but I get it now, and I think about it all the time. But my professor, like when I was ready to just break down crying because I'm like, I have nothing else to give. I have all these exams. I've got so much due, and he just looked at me because he had 2 kids and he was doing a lot, and he just said, "You will never have as much free time as you do right now." And I was like, that's not true. But with the jobs that I know you're all working and the family woes and life and pandemic, you have to find time. You have to find time. And for me, it's downtime. I have to carve out time to just be sitting with a cup of coffee and staring at a painting, and I consider that productive time. Even if it's just early in the morning, like whenever that happens for you, to develop that muscle that you're talking about, Kara, of who am I? What is my voice? what does my visual intuition think, by just letting your eyes kind of look at things and take things in, and you're building that intellectual muscle without even realizing it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's a great way of saying it.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Any other questions? My question is related to when you're talking about how the process of editing down what you're seeing in the landscape is almost what becomes like the concept or idea of the work. Like what you choose to leave in and what you choose to leave out is so important to the message that you can communicate with the work. So I was wondering if you could talk more about what you find in that process of editing things out, or like what you learn about yourself in that process of editing things out, because that's something that we were doing in our last painting, the landscape painting, where you go, I feel like you go to a landscape and you're like, there's no way I can paint all of this, or I can't capture all of this, and you have to make those decisions about what to leave in and what to take out. So I'm thinking about like what do you learn about yourself in that process of like leaving things in or taking things out?
I just watched on Art 21 and kind of a little documentary of a Chinese painter, contemporary painter, and he said that all artists, and this is his point of view, but that all artists in some shape or form are in love with the world and are looking for some way to kind of give something back in return because it's given them something. But then there's this notion, right, that we're small and we can only make using the specific set of abilities that we have. And I'm not saying that in a small way at all, like, but I try to make 3D things and I can't make them. So I make 2D things. And I guess I would say in the process of looking at something so big as the part of the world that I occupy and having to choose, like what is the composition that I'm going to choose, and within that composition, what am I going to exclude, because I can't possibly include every single detail. It's a painting. It's always going to be an interpretation of something else, no matter how realistic it is. I'm constantly reminded of what my abilities are and what my strengths are, and that I have a set of biases towards a certain way of working or a certain way of looking at the world, or even, this is a really simple one, but working horizontally versus vertically, and kind of constantly coming up against the fact that painting is just a series of decisions, and that I tend to make certain decisions over other ones, and wanting to figure out if I should, this sounds really kind of like an umbrella way of thinking about things, but is there a different way I could be doing this? Is there a way to kind of challenge myself towards another way of working? I think that's the main thing I think about when I'm editing down, that I'm consciously making these decisions, and I wonder why.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's a great way of saying it. I just love that idea that like your strengths and your weaknesses, your biases, all of these things are like what give like personality and life to the painting, and being like as intentional as you can with those, I feel like just accentuates that even more and makes, the kind of life behind the painting even like in sharper relief.
Yeah, there's so much space in this world for all of the different types of people that we are, and I think artist envy is a real thing. I think that criticism is a real thing, and finding the ways to just celebrate yourself and say, I am this type of maker, and that's okay, and I can experiment with other things and play with other things, and um, you know, learn new techniques and try on new hats. But at the end of the day, um, embrace who you are, and embrace your voice, and allow yourself to play with that and really enjoy what you're capable of.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eleanor. Maybe that's a perfect place to end. I feel like I got so much out of that. I took a ton of notes. Really appreciate you sharing all that with us. Let's see. I guess any last questions maybe before we wrap up? Anything like burning that you want to ask? I'm sure, Eleanor, you're open to people contacting you as well,
Yeah.
emailing or whatever. If you have another question you want to ask, you can do that. Perfect. And follow on Instagram. That's always a great way to keep in touch.
Yeah. Okay.
Awesome.
Well,
Thank you so, so much.
my pleasure.
That was
Thank you all.
excellent.
Good luck with your class and everything that you all have going on.
Thank you.